Well, there are less than 48 hours to go before the U.S. imposed NAFTA deadline on Monday. A major focus of ongoing negotiations is agriculture and auto manufacturing. One area that has not seen as much of the spotlight is technology and innovation. And increasingly, it's a potentially huge wealth generator. Now, the North American Free Trade Agreement was negotiated in the early 90s, coming into effect in January of 1994. Now, technology wasn't as intricately involved in our lives then as it is now. At the time, negotiators were often thinking about tangible assets like cars and cows, because Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Uber hadn't even been invented yet, really. So this time around, technology and the copyright involved and who owns what is a major factor. The potential now seen in new technologies like blockchain, artificial intelligence, and bioengineering could impact everything from where we work to who has access to our information. So here to discuss these issues, we've got Jesse Hirsch, and he is a futurist and technology columnist, and Kundan Joshi is the CEO of the Apple Lab. Hello to both of you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
All right, so NAFTA is, of course, been dominating the news, but what's not been dominating the news is the aspect of technology. Now, we know that it was signed back in the 90s, the original agreement, and that was before Google, Facebook, and a lot of these sort of innovative technologies that are so, linked to our lives now are. So does tech really need to be included in NAFTA? How important is that? Jesse, let's start with you.
I think it's incredibly important, and it really speaks to the future of the Canadian economy. You mentioned artificial intelligence, which the federal government's spending hundreds of millions of dollars to help develop and promote. Canada's a leader in the blockchain industry in terms of both Canadian companies and developers. But the other is border mobility, that there are a lot of Canadian entrepreneurs, Canadian funders, Canadian developers who regularly travel to the United States. And within the original NAFTA, there was a provision by which you could get a temporary work visa that didn't really account in terms of tech professionals. So that was an area in which we want to see expanded. But that may even be abandoned. So it may be harder for Canadian entrepreneurs, Canadian people in the tech sector to travel to the U.S. market as easily as they have. And that should be frontline news. That should be a major negotiating point, because it will damage our economy considerably if that little tiny provision, important but overlooked, ends up being lost.
And you just touched on it, so Kundan, we'll get you to pick up on this point. In terms of intellectual property, for example, what's at stake here?
Intellectual property is a key ingredient here, because all the startups the entire tech sector is fueled by making sure that within the second or third year of their life, they have US as a market for their consideration. In that particular perspective, IP becomes a major issue for every single startup in that perspective. So making sure that the IP laws are not just equal, but fair, it's more important there. And fair is different from the perspective of each of those countries.
And we want to turn a little bit to e-commerce as well, too, in addition to intellectual property and innovation. So that's another important issue right now. We know that when Canadians are shopping across the border and they spend more than $20 in that cross-border transaction, they have to pay duty on that purchase. Now, the U.S. wants to raise that minimum dollar amount before a duty is applied. So this could mean a lot of competition for Canadian retailers. What's the impact of that? We'll start with you, Jesse.
Well, on the one hand, consumers really desire this, because we are buying a lot online in terms of cross-border, and we've all been hit by those sort of hidden charges or extra charges at the door. But as you inferred, the flip side is there are Canadian e-commerce businesses who've benefited from that type of protectionism. So it speaks to how there are all sorts of little policies that are kind of tied to technology that actually have quite a large impact, both on the Canadian economy and the Canadian consumer's experience. This would be an area where it would be easy to see the Americans' demand and go from $20 to $800. A lot of Canadian e-commerce industry is in favor of that, because they want to see themselves as being competitive, and they go after American customers as much as they go after Canadian customers. So it's these types of small issues that don't have the kind of sizzle that the cattle and the auto industry does, but I think really does have an impact on the way in which we use the internet and the way in which small businesses are competitive in a continental sense.
And very quickly, we are running out of time on this topic, but I just want a final word from you, Gundan, on what would you say is your advice to Canadian negotiators on this front?
Certainly. So I think one topic that we didn't discuss is data, and I think data protection is going to be a very important topic for negotiation. In order for our industries to disrupt and innovate the way we want, it's important that our data needs are met as well, so that the growth of innovation doesn't stagnate from that perspective. I would say if you are a policymaker, it's important for you to understand that technology is going to be a dominant force as far as the economy is considered. So from that perspective, make sure that you keep technology at the forefront of your discussions and negotiations, and accordingly play the ball.
Good advice. All right. Well, thank you for weighing in on this. Another technology story that was in the news, Facebook. There was another security breach impacting about 50 million users. So in terms of this, first, let's start with you, Jesse. How big of a deal is this? What exactly happened?
Well, on the one hand, it speaks to how if you put all your eggs in one basket, you could get into trouble. So this impacted not just people who use Facebook, but then use the Facebook login to enter into other services. And that's why this particular breach was so potentially vulnerable for Facebook and for their users. But it also speaks to the credibility issue that Facebook is struggling with, both in terms of the trust of their users, but more importantly, regulators. Because certainly American and Canadian governments are exploring ways in which they could provide oversight of Facebook and make sure that that data is actually protected, versus Facebook is trying to show that they're responsible, that they are actually in a position to avoid that type of regulation and scrutiny. So this puts more pressure on governments to step up and to provide that type of regulatory oversight. And it also shows how difficult it is for Facebook to protect their almost 2 billion users and all the information that they've offered.
And in terms of this also, I remember it was on Thursday that actually my Facebook accounts were all signed out of, so I guess mine was one of the accounts that was impacted by this breach. But in the statement that came out from Facebook after, it said that Tuesday is when this actually occurred, and then they started taking steps on Thursday. Gundan, what has their response to this been like? And it's not the first time around with Facebook.
Certainly, certainly. So I mean, it sort of shows like the priority of privacy and data on their scale. That being said, I do appreciate the fact that they took on full responsibility and apologized, which is important. However, they need to step up their game. It's very difficult to consider, just as Jesse said, being already in scrutiny, they are under a lot of pressure to make sure that they take this responsibility, and also for regulators to step up and make sure we have the right policies in place to protect the data of all the consumers.
And you know, to that very point, how many times does this have to happen in order for security to be at a level where it can't happen anymore? How proactive does this company need to be? And two-pronged question. I'll put the first one to you and then the second one to you, Gundan. In terms of consumers, Facebook users like me, at what stage do you think people are going to start being like, this is too much? So first with you, and we'll just talk about, you know, what needs to happen for them to actually up their game, Facebook, so this doesn't keep happening.
I think it is a kind of wicked problem that anyone would have trouble with. I mean, if you think about 2 billion users, there's no country that has to deal with governing that amount of people, and we expect Facebook to. But I think the larger issue is alternatives. Where else would you go to see photos of your nieces and nephews or to connect with your family and friends? And that's where Facebook as monopoly has kind of a strong argument to it, that maybe we should have the types of laws that penalize them, lots of money when these mistakes happen, so that they have economic incentive to put greater measures to protect themselves. It's also interesting that the Facebook founders just quit Facebook because they had conflicts with Facebook's founder, Mike Zuckerberg. So
Instagram.
Yeah, so sorry, Instagram. So there are clearly debates going on within the company as to what measures to be taken, but it really comes down to Zuckerberg, because he is the sole controlling shareholder. So it's really our belief in him and our confidence in him to solve these problems.
And it is interesting to see how the Instagram founders departed, as you mentioned. But same question again to you. Do you agree that maybe an economic penalty would make Facebook become more secure, Gundan?
I mean, to be very honest, Facebook's main monetization policy has been based on their consumers' data. So their biggest responsibility has to be associated with their consumers' data, in essence. So when it comes to individuals, I mean, that's something that they need to take that into account and consider how loyal has Facebook been to them, and accordingly make their decisions accordingly. But really, Facebook has to take this extremely with utmost amount of emergency and priority, because they have already started losing out customers, and they will continue to do that. They're in an unfortunate situation. I mean, I don't blame them for it. It's a very difficult position to be in, but their priorities need to be straight, and they need to put all their effort and all their focus on this.
All right. Thank you to you both. We have run out of time. We could talk forever, though, right? Thank you to Jesse Hirsch, and he is a futurist and technology columnist, and to Kundan Joshi. He is the CEO of the App Lab. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.